Hey, well, good evening, everyone. I wish we were there in person, or I was there in person, but I'm not. So I'll do my best to make this a bit fun, although it's a challenge. So my first topic is on agroecology. It's a term that's becoming more commonly used in agriculture. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but I'm going to run through kind of an intro to it and some examples and how it might be of interest and use to you, and if you're kind of thinking more towards the future. It's not a nuts and bolts type of a talk, which my second one is more oriented in that direction. So agroecology actually it's a term that's been around since the early 1920s, before we had the big push to industrialize agriculture, so to speak. And there's a saying, I don't know how many people are familiar with Wendell Berry, but he has this wonderful saying about agriculture that we don't know what we're doing because we don't know what we're undoing. And in a way, that kind of captures, for me, the spirit of agroecology. There's so many parts of the ecosystem, the agricultural ecosystem, that we don't fully understand. And in many cases, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So agroecology is pushing us to think about the ecology of the system, to understand it better and try to have it work with us in our goals for agriculture and food production. There's a number of different definitions, but let's start just with ecology. So agroecology is kind of the marriage of agriculture and ecology, bringing those two areas together. Ecology, the science of connections among living and non-living things, fairly straightforward and simple. And then agroecology is the science of applying ecological concepts and principles to the design and management of farming and food systems. So design and management, particularly design, is a real emphasis of agroecology, that we are more conscious in how we put these farming systems together. Another thing you'll see in definitions about agroecology is the word sustainability. A lot of times it becomes unclear what's the difference between the two. And I guess even for myself, I don't know that there's 100% difference. There's definitely overlap. They kind of feed into one another. So you'll see that in a lot of the discussions of agroecology. Agroecology probably started more with a focus on biophysical aspects, particularly pest management and soil, and things like intercropping and multiple cropping. But over time, it's expanded to include human and social dimensions. And the degree to which more the social science is emphasized kind of depends on the country. There's certain parts of the world, like Latin America, where agroecology has very much of a social movement kind of a feeling to it, versus, say, in Europe, where it's much more about biology. So you'll see kind of some of those differences out there as well. So the agroecology talks about the agroecosystem, which is typically going to be some unit of land, its related resources, the biology to which the agroecological inquiry is being applied. It can range in scale and complexity, from a small garden to a grain field to a watershed. So scale is a big issue, and ideally, as we get better at it, we're able to move up in scale and take advantages of some of the interactions that are happening at that level that we tend to ignore when we're just focusing on one crop in one field. And one of the people who's written a lot about agroecology, a fellow named Vandermeer from University of Michigan, he uses an interesting twist that I kind of like, and that is an agroecosystem is an ecosystem with a human purpose. So it's very much oriented to doing things, getting outputs that we as people want from the ecosystem, but we're trying to work with the natural processes more than we perhaps have in the past 100 or so years. Sometimes there's a tendency to assume that agroecology implies returning to nature, that we do natural farming, but in many ways, nature and farming are diametrically opposed. We replace natural ecosystems with our cropping systems. There's nothing related between the two. So I think in most cases, it's not going to be going back to some native ecosystem, but it's going to be drawing on principles of ecology, perhaps relating to ecosystems that were once there because they're driven by climate and things that haven't changed, but then also the ecology of the crops and other kinds of things we're doing. Sometimes a native ecosystem or a natural ecosystem can be helpful. For example, perhaps a tropical rainforest is useful as a reference point for growing something like coffee. And we see a lot of that. We see coffee production moving from just single species of coffee to multi-species, multi-story, which is much more the environment that coffee trees evolved in. And they're finding some really positive benefits from that. Perhaps the same is true for something like wheat, that the prairie ecosystem has a lot of analogs for our wheat production. And people like Wes Jackson at the Land Institute are trying to develop this idea. Can we have perennial polycultures where there's a grain producing crop that produces edible grains, but it's still drawing on some of those other ecosystem activities, services, functions? I think for most of our crops, it's a lot less obvious. For example, here in central Washington and Wenatchee, where I am, what do orchards have to do with the shrub steppe, sagebrush? That's not a lot in many cases. So we can't necessarily draw that much from the system. Let's see. Several authors have thought about this whole idea of agroecosystems and proposed 4 specific functions or principles of agroecosystems that they suggest if we can try to focus on working with these and monitoring these, then we'll be in a better place as far as trying to achieve some of our goals. And those 4 are productivity, stability, sustainability, and equity. So you kind of see that sustainability theme coming back in there as well. And then another perspective on agroecology was offered by Vandermeer again. And he said, let's think about how we try to solve problems in agriculture. There's kind of the agronomist view, which is more how I've been trained in my agricultural experience. And that is, what problems does the farmer face and how can I help them solve them? That's a very typical way that we try to approach agriculture. But Vandermeer suggests that the agroecologist asks instead, why are things that could be problems not problems? And that really occurred to me. I had the chance to visit in Central Asia, which is the center of origin of apple and pear. And I was with several other growers, and we were walking around looking at apple and pear trees. We didn't see any damage from parasilla, for example. Well, here in Central Washington, parasilla is a major pest. So we just started to wonder, why is that? It's so interesting that they don't have that pest. What can we learn? Is it some natural enemy, et cetera, et cetera? And Vandermeer says this contrast perhaps is something like a curative medicine approach versus a preventative medicine approach, with agroecology more like the preventative. And I thought that was kind of a useful way to understand some of the subtlety of definitions. You've all probably seen definitions of sustainable agriculture, economic, environment, and social aspects, trying to optimize those 3. And it's usually a lot easier to say what is not sustainable than what is. People have proposed strategies for trying to improve our farm sustainability. And one approach to this I find particularly useful, and the agroecologists have kind of honed in on this. So the 3 are efficiency, substitution, and redesign. Efficiency would be like making our sprayers more efficient or making our irrigation more efficient. So we can reduce inputs and perhaps some impacts. And this is usually very easy to do on lots and lots of acres. So the increment of sustainability per unit of change might not be very big, but because a lot of people can use it, we can still see some change. The second is called substitution, and that might be substituting an input or a practice with another that's proven to have lower impact or better performance. And that could be using pheromone mating disruption for codling moth in apples. And that's become actually the standard control here in Central Washington as we phased out a lot of the insecticides. So we're still intervening and controlling the pest, but we're using a very different type of material with ideally a lot less negative impacts. It delivers more sustainability improvement per unit, but perhaps is a little harder to adopt. Then the third one is redesign, and that's where the structure of the agroecosystem is starting to be changed. This is that design term that I mentioned earlier. And this is clearly the hardest one. It's the one we need the most knowledge on. It's the one that's most difficult for people to just try to get where I am and keep going.
Sure, that would be great.
Okay.
So go down to
Oh, come on.
okay, no, you don't. Wait, no, wait, stop. Go to 4. Oh, wait, no.
Okay, so we were talking about these 3 principles or 3 strategies for sustainability that feed into agroecology. And I was mentioning this redesign idea. Here's a great example from Iowa, where typically you grow a large field of corn and next to it you grow a large field of soybeans, and maybe you rotate between them as you go from one year to the next. But they've looked at what happens if we move to this strip system. So we divide our fields into these narrow strips, and in this case, they have 3 different crops: the barley, the soybeans, and the corn. So this, this is a fairly substantial change in the way that farmers farm in Iowa. And the reason it was of interest because they figured out that light limitation was a big factor. So if we start to grow corn in wider and wider rows, now the corn in the middle becomes light limited and we have significant yield reductions. But if you can stick with 6 rows of corn, you don't have that. So they did a lot of work on this, and you can sort of see what happens as we go from 1 row in a strip out to 12. Corn yield declines while soybean yield kind of comes up. And finding that optimum point, this is where this kind of research is critical, starts to lead to a condition where actually you are over yielding. You're actually getting more yield per unit of land than if you grew them separately. And that's one of the classic attempts that agroecology is trying to achieve. Okay, let's see, that's not gonna work, so we'll just keep going. And it may be that, there's also things happening below ground. So for example, here's a study that was done on intercropping flax and sorghum. And when they put the flax in with the sorghum, flax yields went up 46%. Sorghum yields went down 7%. And often you'll see these kinds of things. It's not always a positive for everybody, but the net is significantly higher overall yield. And this was ascribed to below ground interactions from this mycorrhizal network, which is a fungal network that really improved resource sharing between the 2 plants. And that network didn't occur in the same way or function as well when the plants were by themselves. So a great example of that kind of synergy that happens as we start to uncover some of these opportunities. Okay, so Becky, I don't know, I kind of ran through that pretty quick, but I'm going to dive into some examples. If anyone had a question at this point, be happy to entertain it. If not, I'll just forge ahead. So in a way, to me, that this talks about possibilities. We're learning all the time, and we're asking questions that we never asked before. So now we have the chance to learn things because of the questions. And I think one of the things that kind of illustrates this as good as any is what's happened with the human microbiome in medicine. So essentially, we've now come to realize that some 90% of the cells in our body are not human cells. There are all kinds of different microbial cells that inhabit us, in us, on us, and are integral to our function and our health. But think about the development of medicine for the past 100 or so years. It's just about ignored that entire side of us, that 90%. And therefore, what do we really know about medicine and human health? Not a heck of a lot if we've ignored 90% of us. And that's what this book is trying to get at. And I think the analogy to agriculture is really similar. There's all sorts of opportunities out there because huge parts of the agroecosystem we've flat out ignored or we wiped out, and therefore we really don't know how to work with them. So one example, again, coming back to mycorrhizae, this is huge. The mycorrhizal connections are through many, many kinds of plants and many kinds of communities, and they're essentially communicating. Plants can't move around, they don't speak like we do, but they definitely communicate and interact. And we're just starting to appreciate how widely spread and important that is. And they're sharing nutrients, they're sharing defense signals, they're sharing allelochemicals, all of which can influence establishment of plants, growth, physiology, defense against diseases and pests. Huge amounts of things going on that, again, we just basically ignored for the past 100 years of research. A great example was one study I saw where these folks took a field of crop, and I can't remember if it was a bean field, doesn't matter. But at one end of the field, they challenged some plants either with a pathogen, they inoculated it with a fungus, or they put some insects there that were eating on the plants. And 6 hours later, at the other end of the field, the plants that had never seen the insects or the disease, they started to show genetic change that upregulated the genes for stress response due to pathogens or herbivores. So basically, in 6 hours, the damaged plants sent out the messages and the unaffected plants got it and started creating defenses. Pretty interesting stuff, just things we've completely been oblivious to for a long time. One of the most interesting examples is the tree talk that's been discovered up in British Columbia. And if you're interested, there's a wonderful TED talk by Susan Simard from University of British Columbia. But the work she did with tracers and all sorts of things on mycorrhizal connections is just astonishing. And she found that mother trees that created seed and the seeds established in the forest and grew, they were connected in a mycorrhizal network to where the mother tree actually could recognize the progeny and differentially send resources, nutrients to that tree to the exclusion of others. This is just crazy stuff. But it leads us to ask what's happening in fruit orchards. We have virtually no idea and no sense of the opportunity there to work with mycorrhiza. Example. But the microbes aren't just in the soil, they're on the leaves as well. There's another aspect of the ecosystem. Typically, we think of scab, we try to nuke the scab, and in the process, we wipe out most everything else on the leaf, and we don't worry about it. Here's an example from a study on tomato where they were working for control of Pseudomonas, a bacterial disease, and they came up with several different selected micro mixes, so to speak, that they thought might help protect it. And they sprayed it on, and sure enough, they did get a response. So essentially, here's the untreated versus where they treated it. Let's see, diluted and then undiluted. So the degree of protection did show somewhat of a dose dependent, but then they put fertilizer on it. And by adding fertilizer to the plants, it completely negated this beneficial microbe response. And this just shows how complicated things are and gets back to that point that we don't know what we're undoing, what beneficial things we're undoing when we spray a foliar spray, for example, for nutrients. Just lots of things like that out there that are potential to help us in the future. Here's another one. Some work was done here in Wenatchee and in Prosser. The fact that when plants are attacked by insects that chew on their leaves, it does trigger a chemical response. And many plants release these volatile chemicals that then drift out and move around the agroecosystem. And they trigger a response by parasitoids to the pest that has just eaten them. And it essentially draws some of those pests, those parasitoids or beneficial insects in to try to attack the pests and get rid of that infestation. So this is an area that there's some really good evidence that we can do some things here, but when we start looking at landscape level with multiple crops, it gets incredibly complicated. And I'd say we're not really there yet. Another example in rice. So rice plants have this particular pest of the brown leafhopper, and it has different life stages. When it's got its short wings, it can't fly away, so it stays and it feeds on the rice, but at some point it changes and it grows long wings and it flies away. Well, it turns out that change in physiology, the insect, is driven by the plant, and that older rice plants have higher glucose, and that high glucose stimulates the change from short to long wing. And if you inject the insect with glucose, you actually induce that change, it flies away and it doesn't damage the plant, the crop. So again, crazy things that are out there that we're just learning about and we have the potential to utilize. So let's move to some specific examples from tree fruit. Probably one of the best examples in terms of agroecology, this idea of working with ecosystems, understanding ecology of pests and the crop and how they're interacting and designing things. Biocontrol. There's been a huge amount of work and a lot of successes in biocontrol in fruits worldwide. And here's a nice simple example that I found from China, where in a lot of their commercial citrus, the red mite, citrus red mite is a significant pest. And it turns out there's an indigenous predatory mite that is pretty effective control of the red mite, but it's just usually not around enough at either the right time or in high enough numbers. But a particular weed that's present in many of these citrus regions, I don't know the common name for this one, but this weed is a great habitat for the predatory mite. And simply by not killing the weed out, by trying to spray it out with herbicides or whatever they would do, the presence of that weed would allow the buildup of the predatory mites and they would control the citrus red mite. That's a perfect example of trying to work with that ecosystem and get it to be a much more self-regulating system where we humans don't need to intervene, and yet we're getting the crop and the quality that we want. And this was a great example because it spread to some 100,000 hectares of citrus, very much adopted at a commercial level. Another example along those lines would be the woolly apple aphid. This was really well controlled in apples while we were using broad spectrum insecticides. But now that those are gone, this pest is becoming more and more of a problem. And again, just like in the citrus example, there is a parasitoid. There are some syrphid flies that are known to be parasitoids of the apple aphid, but they're usually not around or not in high enough numbers. So Betsy Beers here in Wenatchee did a bunch of screening. Are there some flowering plants that are particularly attractive to this syrphid? And if there are, can we plant them and draw them in and get some kind of a biocontrol by that? So this was actually tested, and they screened a number of different flowers. It turned out that alyssum, sweet alyssum, by far was the best at attracting this. And it did lead to some biocontrol. And actually, one of the growers she worked with planted it on 20 acres of a new apple orchard. So it kind of proved the idea that a grower could take and redesign their orchard simply by changing what's in their alleys from grass to this alyssum and have the potential to have some built-in biocontrol. That was a nice example right here in Wenatchee. Another example for biocontrol was with leaf rollers. There's a couple different species that are pretty regular pests in our apple orchards. And there was no good parasitoid of leaf roller that was native to the area. But one had been introduced in British Columbia that had moved into Washington and is now established. But again, it's not usually around when the leaf rollers start to become a problem. And then they get economic damage in the orchards and they need to treat. So people started looking around and they said, is there some sort of plant we can put out there that would be an alternate habitat and perhaps is going to have an alternate host in it as well? And it turned out that the wild rose, which is a native plant here in central Washington, just the wild roses that grow here, were a good alternate habitat for this particular parasitoid. And by planting these around the edges of the orchard, they were able to draw that organism in, have it there at the time when the leaf rollers were starting to build in the orchard, and they would move from the rose hedges around the edge into the orchard, kind of following the buildup and really do a decent job of control. And the researchers looked at this at landscape level. They planted it in 2000. They monitored these leaf rollers around this block starting in 2001. And by 2003, you can start to see it is spreading across that block, and they're finding evidence of good control throughout the block. So a nice example that, yes, this actually did have a benefit in the real world. Another example, a little different than our classic idea of biocontrol, but based on ecology, the parasilla, apparently the females send out a vibrational signal. It's not I don't know if you call it sound, but it's a vibration uh, out to the male. That's their way of communicating. Instead of a pheromone, it's through this vibration. And they send it through the plant, through the leaves and the twigs. And they're somehow able to communicate so the male can come find the female and mate. Well, the researchers working on this project started to look at that. They were able to identify the signal and synthesize it. And now they're actually trying to take it to the orchard where in a lot of our new orchards, we've got these pear trees on trellises with wires, and you can kind of see the wire up here. Their idea is, can they put some sort of device on that wire that makes that same vibration and sends it out through the pear trees and potentially has the opportunity to disrupt this whole interaction between the male and the female. A similar idea was tried in grapes for the grape leafhopper, and apparently they shut down mating by 90%. So a really interesting possibility. It was the first time I'd heard of acoustic-based mating disruption, very different than the pheromone-based that we're used to. Even simple practices like mowing, we haven't looked at, well, what's the effect of mowing frequency on the insects in the orchard? And if we mowed less, would it be better or worse? No one's really looked at that until this study was done here in the region. And so they monitored a whole range of beneficial insects as well as pest insects. And they compared weekly mowing to monthly mowing to unmowed. And essentially what they show here is the ratio between the weekly mowing to the monthly or the unmowed. So if the weekly mowing was one syrphid fly, then the monthly boosted that to about 2.5, but the unmowed boosted it to 15. So pretty significant increases in ladybugs and syrphids and some of these other ones at a lesser level. But at the same time, the pests also responded. So here's the stink bug, which is a pest, can be a serious pest of pear. It went up by almost 40 times. So the conclusion is we don't know enough really to try to manage mowing to affect some good pest control. But obviously mowing affects all these organisms in the orchard, and we need to know some more about what we're actually doing when we mow that orchard. Finally, on biocontrol, one of the simplest things to do is to not kill the good guys that are there. And typically you'll see a table like this in the spray guides from WSU and other places where they list the pests, and here's the different pesticides that might control them. Well, in this case, these are the beneficials. And the researchers have gone through and done a lot of screening of what's the effect of all these different potential pest controls, these pesticides, on all these different beneficial insects. And we can start to see some are particularly hard on the beneficials, like this one here, and others not at all. So it starts to give the growers and the pest consultants some ability to say, well, if I've got a choice, can I pick a pesticide that's going to have a lot less disruption than one other one and still get the same level of control? So we're just conserving the biocontrol that might be out there. And it's pretty simple. It's kind of like that efficiency idea I mentioned earlier. Another part of the ecosystem that we're manipulating is light. And often we don't necessarily think about light, but light is such a driver in our orchards because light is the key part that leads to photosynthesis, which is what makes up most of our trees. We've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is water, air, and light. And if we don't have good light, we're not going to have good photosynthesis. So already we're redesigning orchards from tree density and architecture are dwarfing rootstocks on high density systems, like in this photo of apple. This is where most orchard systems are going now, particularly as they get the germplasm of the rootstock that allows them to do that. And that provides uniform light throughout the canopy, which is huge in terms of fruit quality. That's a really, really big factor. But interestingly, as we start to do this, the trees can't even hold themselves up anymore. So now we have to bring in all this other material, the posts, the trellises, the trellis wires, just to hold the trees up. So we've kind of made this trade-off, and it's an interesting one to think about. Similarly, there's a lot of work going on with netting, which in many cases is affecting light here because of our intense sun. It's for sunburn. Other places it might be for wind protection or hail protection. But that netting does affect light. And in some cases, there's been stimulation of tree growth and fruit yield. And there's been water conservation, there's been some other effects. So that one practice actually changes a lot in the agroecosystem that we need to know about. And then the same is true for reflective fabrics. We see a lot of people putting these out for different purposes, and they do affect tree growth, fruit yield, fruit quality, etc. They can suppress weeds, and they can also affect pests. There's some work now with reflective fabric and controlling parasilla, for example. It looks like the wavelengths that come off that material are antagonistic to that particular pest insect, and they don't want to come into the orchard. So another idea there that might be able to be used. Tree fruit mulch, hopefully I'll be talking about this after this talk, but just as an example, we put mulches out there and they change a number of parts of the agroecosystem. They can suppress weeds, conserve water, definitely have seen really good responses for tree performance. They can enhance biocontrol. We did a study with EPN, which is entomopathogenic nematodes. These are beneficial nematodes, and the potential to control overwintering codling moth. Well, the mulch provided a habitat for these guys to survive and find the codling moth that bare ground did not. So we were able to achieve 90 to 95% control of codling moth down in that mulch where we had it versus bare ground. And obviously mulches are going to help with our soil and stimulate the plant health. So mulch has a number of effects, but flip side, we could say, well, let's everyone use mulch. We need to keep looking because there's usually issues that we need to at least be aware of. And in this case, there are several fungi that become post-harvest pests, pathogens that start in the orchard, get on the fruit, and then end up causing storage rots. And it may be that these mulch materials are actually really good habitat for them as well. So there's a possibility that in some cases, that could be a negative factor. We may not want to use those mulches. Here's an example of a kind of an unexpected result in a study done up in Canada where Jerry Nielsen and his colleagues did a lot of research on mulches in orchards. And in this particular one, they tried a whole range of mulches. These are all different mulches here. The check is this blue bar. And geotextile, this essentially is the black weed fabric kind of a mulch, that's here. So in between are all different types of organic mulches. And these are examples of the nematodes per 100 milliliters of soil, just looking at the nematode community in these plots. So you can see that the bacterial feeding, for the most part, all these organic mulches really did lead to some pretty good increases in them, but even more so for the beneficial nematodes that are omnivorous and or predatory. And these ones can be good, effective biocontrol organisms. Again, it's not something we typically try to manage, but in this case, we prompted it through the addition of mulch. And for those three mulches that had the biggest response for these omnivorous predatory nematodes, those are the same where the plant parasitic nematode, the root lesion or Pretilencus, which is a major pest of our fruit trees, they virtually are gone where we had these three mulches. So there's a pretty good connection between enhancing these populations with mulch and creating some biocontrol of the pest. Again, they weren't looking to do that, but it was a side effect of this change of the orchard environment through mulch. Replant disease has become a bigger and bigger problem, not just here in Washington, but worldwide. And fumigation is pretty much the industry standard response. But there's been a lot of work on alternatives, particularly by Mark Mazzola with the USDA. And one of the things he found is that by growing wheat before we replant the apples, there was some really interesting changes in the soil biology, that the wheat root system kind of pushed the microbiology of the soil back to as if apples had never grown there, kind of in a virgin soil. And we know the difference between our virgin soils and soils that have had apple is just tremendous, huge, huge growth response. So he played around with this and he was able to get some control, but it turns out that it's not as simple as saying, grow wheat before you plant apples again, because the response was wheat cultivar dependent. Not all wheat root systems are the same from a microbiology standpoint. And you can see that this spring wheat Penawawa gave by far a better response to growing before the apples. These are the apple seedlings than these other two. And here's our control with no treatment, apple to apple, and they basically don't grow. So this was pretty interesting. And it kind of emphasizes the idea that if we're going to try to work with some of these agroecology principles and practices, we always are going to need to know more, because things aren't as simple as they are with a chemical type response. An example for rodents. Rodents are a problem for us here, particularly the voles. It turns out that there was a nice study done by some wildlife ecologists that established the feeding preferences for these voles. Their favorite food was white clover, and at the bottom of the list was a gallium species that was found out in the wild. Gallium is a genus, and there's another plant you may know called sweet woodruff, Gallium odoratum, that we often use as an ornamental and has actually been used as an orchard cover crop in some cases. So we had played around with white clover and found this research, and sure enough, we planted it and the rodents went crazy and basically ate it all up. And then we tried some experiments with gallium in the tree row instead, and sure enough, we measured a reduction in the rodents. So very interesting potential there to use plants to influence rodents and how they're interacting with the orchard. Another example, weed fabric is known to be a real attraction to voles, whilst wood chips for us has not been. The voles basically don't like them. But in some cases, it'd be nice to combine those two practices. And actually in blueberries, this is what they were playing around with, because wood chips are typically used on blueberries, but they were having weed problems. So they wanted to incorporate the fabric. And what they found is that where they had the wood chip mulch underneath and then covered it with the weed fabric, they didn't have the vole problems. If they did the opposite, they did. And that's kind of what you can see here. We did a similar experiment. This is a fabric material underneath the wood chips, and the voles would come to the edge of the tree row. They get under that fabric material, run right over to the trunk, come right up and chew the trunk, which is what you see here. So just by reversing the position of those two, we could have eliminated that problem. So a lot to learn just about something like voles and what they like or don't like. Finally, an example, livestock integration. There's not much of that commercially here in the state, but in other parts of the world, there is a bit of that. For example, sheep grazing in orchards, particularly in places like England and New Zealand, where apple scab is an issue, and they find that the sheep do eat enough of the leaves that it does reduce scab inoculum, and it does help them control. It's not typically enough, but it helps just reduce that inoculum load. So pretty simple type of practice. There's obviously food safety issues that have to be dealt with, but potentially you're producing another product as well, which is a great economic benefit. So just another example of changing the elements of the agroecosystem to try to achieve some specific outcomes. So thinking about orchard systems, what's missing? I'd say more basic ecological understanding. We're always learning new things, and it just gives us new pieces of the puzzle to work with. So that's certainly one, but perhaps even more than that, we've done a tremendous amount of work on a lot of different pieces. Typically, they're done by a particular specialist, and they focus on what that means for their specific slice of the system. But there's very little integration. And so, for example, when I did that project with the entomologist on the mulch, we were combining his work on the nematodes as a biocontrol with my work as mulch. And we found that putting those two pieces of research together led to some new possibilities. So I think we need to invest more resources in integrating findings and trying to take some of those leaps ahead with our knowledge. And then finally, there's lots of people trying some interesting things out there on the ground, like this food forest in New Zealand, that we're probably not going to tackle in the research world typically. It's very difficult to create replicated plots with this sort of thing. So how can we do research to try to understand what's going on in some of these systems, and then draw out of those some new relationships that we can put into trials where we can say, yeah, it looks like these are real things that will work in our commercial systems, but we're observing them in this more real world setting, like this food forest. And we need to let some of these systems happen at field scale. We need to let them go for multiple years, because it takes time for some of these ecological changes to to happen for some of these relationships to establish themselves. So I think that's another area where more work done. This whole design area is a big one in the agroecology world. Already we're redesigning our orchards, no question about it. We've gone to the dwarf trees on the trellises, et cetera. That's a major, major redesign. But what haven't we thought about in that redesign? We haven't thought about the orchard floor, for example. We haven't thought about putting hedgerows or row end plantings, ways to diversify the vegetation for specific purposes. We haven't thought much about the soil, getting a little more attention now, nor have we thought about, can we actually put in multiple tree species and still manage it in a commercial fashion? That's obviously a real big challenge there. But as I mentioned earlier, as we're doing this, what are we undoing in terms of growing trees that can't hold themselves up? And therefore we have to put all these inputs in to hold the trees up and create some more impact on the system that we don't really want to be doing. So in some cases, people are taking this design thing and just running with it, trying some very, very radical changes. This is from Wisconsin, which was typically corn, soybeans, alfalfa, grains, and livestock. That's the typical crops we've introduced into what used to be a eastern woodland system. And this particular farm's trying to redesign it. That's drawing on some of the native plants, the native organisms that are out there, still producing fruit, nuts, berries, and animals, and trying to do it entirely with renewable energy. And again, this is the kind of system, can we have some studies of these places that tease out some really key changes that they're eliciting from the ecosystem that we're not going to see in our commercial systems, but still that we could apply to them and benefit from. Another area I think is trying to assess the impact, and certainly agroecology wants to have positive change. It's focused on the sustainability idea, but unless we're having some measurement, we don't know whether we're having the impact we think or that we want. So I had mentioned, what's the consequence of the orchard intensification? I think in many ways there is greater environmental impact. There's certainly some benefits, but there's some trade-offs. We need to understand where we come out in the balance. What's the environmental footprint of the orchard? There are some people doing this with life cycle assessment studies, and it takes a number of them to start to get a feeling for what the results are saying. What are the economic costs for these various agroecology strategies? We might find something that works great, but it's got to work economically as well, which kind of gets back to that sustainability, balancing economic, environment, and social. There's opportunities to look at external costs. For example, what's the cost of carbon capture? We are now starting to see numbers. And so if our trees are accumulating carbon as they grow and put on wood, are there ways to bring that into the economic system of the orchard and help with it as well? And then I mentioned that really agroecology, the ideal is this self-regulating system. We understand the elements, we put them together, and then things take care of themselves. We don't need to do much but go out and pick the fruit and enjoy it. Well, that's going to be tough to do, but at some level, we're going to be able to achieve improvements in that direction. So I'll just talk for a minute on footprints, which is one way of trying to measure the impact, the change. Footprint simply is a measure of the impact of a system, practice, or product on one or more, typically environmental factors. There are people that are doing social footprinting as well now, but environmental is where it started. But often we're going to need a reference point. What are we comparing it to? That can be a challenge. And here's a few examples. You've probably all heard of food miles. Well, I think it's actually a pretty poor metric because it doesn't take into account the production energy, just pretty much the transport, and the fact that traveling by rail or by pickup truck or electric vehicle, you may have very different impacts. And so you can't really compare them with the food miles. But if you looked at energy use, you can definitely do an energy footprint or energy budget for a farm and get a sense. And you can ask questions, well, is the energy renewable or not? And is it primary energy that you're actually pouring in the gas tank, or the energy that's in your machinery, the embedded energy? Those are two very different energies, and your conclusion will depend on how you look at those. We can certainly do water footprints, both the quantity and the quality. And we can do global warming, greenhouse gas type footprints. And then we can combine them in what's called the life cycle assessment. This is a process that was developed for industry, but it's being adapted to agriculture. It's a lot harder to use in agricultural systems, but people are doing it. Essentially, it's an environmental analysis. People use the cradle to grave, but you don't have to. You can define what parts of the system you're trying to measure, and then you run your analysis on that and try to come out with some sort of a quantitative measure of the impact of that system. But I think in tree fruit and actually a lot of agriculture, we start with a small inherent footprint, I would argue, that you could go out and plant a tree. You can water it, have the rain water it. You can pick the fruit, eat it, throw the core on the ground, it decomposes. You have almost zero impact with a single tree being managed like that. But as soon as we start to add management, we add footprint. So all these things on this list, these all add footprint to the system. They're all part of the management we're doing as we scale things up and try to commercialize it. So that's a real challenge for us. How do we balance the need to produce, to have commercial systems, and yet try to minimize the impact? And I think, compared to something like a car, agriculture is in relatively good shape, but using this life cycle assessment or these footprint tools can help us at least understand if we're moving in the direction we want as we make some of these agroecology changes. So in concluding this part, I would say that I don't think just doing, quote, agroecology is some guaranteed solution that we're going to solve all our problems. I think it's an approach, it's a mindset, it's a methodology perhaps that is going to be very, very helpful, but it also takes a lot of work. This redesign piece, as I mentioned, can be very, very difficult. It takes a lot of time and expense to generate usable information from these ecological approaches, but it can help with integration of existing knowledge. I really think that's an opportunity that's out there. And the microbial world probably is one of the biggest. We've got a huge amount of opportunity to learn and to apply what we can about partnering with the microbes that are around us. So a final question would be, can we intensify production for quality, which is a big issue with our fruit, for economics, without dramatically ramping up the footprint? And let's do some of these footprint type studies to set baselines and then use them to monitor whether we're making progress. So with that, that finishes my first presentation. Becky, you want to go ahead and fire off with some questions?